Welcome to Vesper Shroud, the place where the line between small-town charm and something far darker gets thinner with every story. Tonight, we're traveling across Pennsylvania, through towns you've heard of, and places locals avoid after sunset. These aren't made-up tales. They come from miners, hikers, night shift workers, and strangers who tried to forget what followed them home. If true horror keeps you curious, tap subscribe and turn on notifications. I promise, the next story will find you. Now take a breath, because once we start, the quiet won't feel so comforting anymore. Story 1, I-95 corridor. The bodies all had the same mark, a symbol carved into their left shoulder blade, precise and deliberate, like a signature. 12 young men in 3 years, all found within a 2-mile stretch of Interstate 95 in Philadelphia. And I know who is next because I saw my own face in the killer's photographs. What makes someone hunt along America's busiest highways? What kind of terrifying predator chooses victims so carefully that police can find a single connection between them except the road where they died? My name is David Chen, and I am a long-haul trucker. They've driven I-95 from Maine to Florida 1,000 times, but the Philadelphia corridor always felt different. Darker, like the highway itself was watching everyone who passed through. I never understood why until the night I picked up that leather journal at a rest stop and realized I was staring at a dead man's diary. A killer, a meticulous record of 12 murders. And on the last page, a photograph of me climbing into my truck, dated 3 days ago, with a single word written underneath, next. It started 2 weeks back on a Friday night run from New York to Baltimore. I pulled into the Brandywine rest area around midnight to grab coffee and stretch my legs. The place was nearly empty, just a few cars in the lot and one other truck idling near the diesel pumps. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes every rest stop feel like a scene from a nightmare. I was walking back to my truck when I noticed something on the ground near the entrance. A leather-bound journal, expensive looking, lying in a puddle near the curb. No one was around to claim it, so I picked it up, thinking I'd turn it in to the attendant. But when I opened it to look for a name, what I saw made my stomach drop. The first page showed a hand-drawn map of I-95 through Philadelphia. 12 red X marks along the highway, each one numbered and dated. Beneath the map, in precise handwriting, was a list of names. Names I recognized from news reports. The missing young men from the Kensington area and beyond. The unsolved cases that had been haunting Philadelphia for 3 years. My hands started shaking. This was a confession, a record. I flipped through more pages and found detailed entries about each victim. Where they were taken, how long they were kept, what was done to them before they died. The level of detail was horrifying and specific. Times, locations, methods, and photographs. Polaroids taped to the pages showing young men bound and terrified, looking directly at the camera. The last victim, this entry was dated 6 weeks ago. Anthony Rodriguez, 23, last seen leaving his shift at a warehouse in Port Richmond. His body had been found 3 days later near the highway. Cause of death listed as exposure, though police suspected foul play. The journal described everything: where he'd been grabbed, the abandoned building where he'd been held, the exact moment he stopped struggling. I should have called the police immediately. Should have handed over the journal and let them handle it. But I kept reading, and that is when I found the final page. The one that made me understand the true horror of what I discovered. It was blank except for a single photograph and one word. The photograph showed me, clear as day, standing next to my truck at this exact rest stop 3 days earlier, my face visible in the frame. And underneath, written in that same precise handwriting, next. Target acquired. Observation phase complete. Terror flooded through me like ice water. The killer had been watching me, stalking me. I was the 13th victim, and this journal had been left here deliberately. A calling card, a way to let me know I'd been chosen. I ran to my truck and locked the doors, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. I scanned the parking lot for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was watching. The other truck near the diesel pumps was gone. The few cars I'd seen earlier had disappeared. I was alone in that vast empty lot with the horrible knowledge that a serial killer had marked me for death. I called 911, gave them everything. My location, the journal, the photographs, the detailed confessions. The dispatcher told me to stay in my vehicle and keep my doors locked. Police were on their way. 20 minutes, maybe less. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. Every shadow in the parking lot seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. I kept the journal open on the passenger seat, forcing myself to read more, trying to understand the pattern, trying to figure out how this person selected victims. And that is when I noticed something chilling. Every victim had been a young man between 20 and 30. Every victim had been alone on I-95 late at night. Every victim had stopped at a rest area within that 2-mile corridor. And every victim had been carved with the same symbol on their left shoulder blade before they died. The symbol was drawn in the journal's margin, 3 intersecting lines forming a shape I didn't recognize. Beneath it, a note, the mark of passage, the sign they'd been chosen to cross over. I didn't understand what that meant. Cross over to where? This wasn't just murder. This was ritual, something deeper and more disturbing than random violence. Blue and red lights finally appeared in my mirrors. 2 police cruisers pulled into the lot, and I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly cried. I climbed out of my truck with the journal held up, ready to hand over everything I found. The officers approached cautiously, hands near their weapons. Standard procedure. I explained what I discovered, showed them the journal, pointed to my photograph on the last page. They examined it carefully, their expressions growing more serious with each page they turned. One officer radioed for detectives while the other stayed with me, asking questions. Where exactly had I found it? Had I touched anything else? Had I seen anyone suspicious? I answered everything, my voice shaking, still scanning the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. The detective arrived 30 minutes later. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah Morrison from the Philadelphia Police Department, and the moment she looked at the journal, her face went pale. She knew these cases, had been working them for 2 years with no breaks, no leads, no suspects. And now here was a complete confession dropped literally at her feet. She took my statement, photographed the journal's pages, and arranged for me to give a full interview at the precinct. But here is where things took a terrifying turn. As we were preparing to leave, another officer approached with a laptop, his expression troubled. He run my information through the system, standard background check, and he found something disturbing. According to traffic camera footage along I-95, my truck had been at 4 of the 12 dump sites within hours of when the bodies were discovered. Not at the exact times, not close enough to make me a suspect, but close enough to establish a pattern. The detective, his eyes narrowed. She asked where I'd been on specific dates. I pulled out my logbooks, my GPS records, my fuel receipts. Everything checked out. I was nowhere near Philadelphia when most of these men disappeared. I was documented hundreds of miles away, making deliveries, sleeping in truck stops, living my normal life. But the coincidence was unsettling. 4 times in 3 years, I'd driven past within hours of a body being dumped. 4 times out of 12. The detective asked if I knew any of the victims. I didn't. Had I ever been to Kensington? Only passing through on the highway. Did I have any connection to the area? None whatsoever. She let me go but told me not to leave the state. They need more interviews, more documentation, more proof that I was a victim being stalked rather than a killer trying to establish an alibi. I drove straight home to my apartment in Newark. 4 hours of paranoid highway driving where every car behind me felt like a threat. I parked in my building, this garage, and practically ran to my unit on the 3rd floor. Once inside with the door locked and bolted, I finally felt safe enough to breathe. That safety lasted exactly 3 hours. I woke up at 4 in the morning to find my apartment door standing wide open. Not broken, not forced, just open, as if I left it unlocked and someone had simply walked in. I grabbed my phone and the baseball bat I keep by my bed and searched every room. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. Except on my kitchen table, I found something that made my blood turn to ice. Another journal, identical to the first, same leather binding, same precise handwriting, but this one was different. This one only had entries about me, page after page documenting my life, my roots, my schedule, my habits, photographs taken from a distance showing me at different truck stops, different rest areas, different cities. The journal went back 6 months, half a year of surveillance, half a year of someone watching my every move, learning my patterns, waiting for the right moment. And on the last page, that symbol again, the 3 intersecting lines. But this time, it was drawn in something dark and rust-colored. Something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Beneath the symbol, new words. You've seen the others. Now you understand. The highway demands passage. 12 have crossed. You are the 13th. The circle closes at the Girard Point Bridge. Midnight tomorrow. Come alone or everyone you've ever cared about crosses instead. A threat, a demand, an ultimatum. I called Lieutenant Morrison immediately. She arrived with a full forensics team within an hour. They processed my apartment, collected the journal, documented everything. But the killer had been careful. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace evidence except the journals themselves. Morrison believed me now. The surveillance was too detailed, too extensive for this to be a setup. Someone had been stalking me for months, and they used the I-95 murders to draw me in, to make me part of their horrifying ritual. She wanted to set up a sting operation at the Girard Point Bridge. Undercover officers, surveillance teams, they'd catch this person and end the killing spree. But she also warned me that this killer had been impossibly careful for 3 years. Never left evidence, never made mistakes. The chance of them actually showing up was slim. I spent the next day in protective custody, going over every detail with investigators. They connected the 12 victims now, found the pattern we all missed. Every young man had been at a rest stop within 48 hours of disappearing. Everyone had used the same ATM at the Brandywine rest area to withdraw cash. The security footage showed a figure in the background of each transaction. Always distant, always obscured, but always there. The killer was using the rest stop as a hunting ground, watching, selecting, following victims home and taking them days later when they felt safe. And now I was the final target. Midnight arrived. I sat in an unmarked police car near the Girard Point Bridge, wired with a microphone, surrounded by hidden officers. The bridge loomed above us, its lights reflecting off the dark water of the Schuylkill River. Traffic was light, just the occasional car passing overhead. Nothing happened. Midnight came and went. 12:30, 1 o'clock. The killer was a no-show. Lieutenant Morrison called it off at 2. Told me I'd be under protection for the next few weeks while they continued investigating. She assigned officers to watch my apartment, monitor my routes, keep me safe until they caught this person. But as we were leaving, I saw something that made my heart stop. On the bridge railing, exactly at the midpoint, someone had hung a piece of cloth. It fluttered in the wind, barely visible in the darkness. Morrison sent an officer to retrieve it. It was a shirt, a man, this shirt covered in dried blood. And carved into the fabric with a knife was that symbol, the 3 intersecting lines, and beneath it, 13 hash marks. 12 crossed out, 1 still open. The shirt belonged to Anthony Rodriguez, the last official victim. It had been hanging there for weeks, maybe months. A trophy, a marker, a sign that the killer considered this bridge sacred ground. And I realized with mounting horror that I missed something crucial. I read both journals cover to cover, memorized every detail, but I focused on the victims, on the surveillance, on the photographs. I never looked at the handwriting closely, never compared it to anything, never considered that it might be familiar because I'd seen it before. In my logbooks, in my fuel receipts, in the notes I kept about my routes and schedules, the handwriting was mine, exactly mine. Perfect copies of my own script. But I hadn't written those journals. I knew I hadn't, which meant someone had studied my handwriting so carefully they could replicate it perfectly. Someone who wanted to make it look like I'd been documenting my own crimes. Someone who spent 6 months learning to be me. Morrison saw my expression, asked what was wrong. I showed her the handwriting comparison, watched her face change as she understood the implications. This wasn't just a serial killer. This was someone who found a way to frame me for 12 murders while simultaneously making me their 13th victim. If I died, the journals would be found. My handwriting would be identified. The circumstantial evidence of my truck being near 4 dump sites would suddenly seem damning. I did go down in history as the I-95 killer, and the real murderer would disappear forever. The perfect crime, the ultimate identity theft. I am telling you this story now because it's been 3 months and they found the killer. I am in witness protection with a new name, a new life, staying off the highways I used to call home. But every night, I dream about that bridge, about the symbol, about the 13th mark waiting to be crossed out. And sometimes I wake up to find dried mud on my shoes from places I don't remember visiting. Find photographs on my phone I don't remember taking. Find hours missing from my memory with no explanation. The detectives say it is trauma, stress, the mind playing tricks after months of fear. But I am starting to wonder if the real horror is something else entirely. Something more disturbing than a stalker or a serial killer. What if the person who has been following me for 6 months, learning my handwriting, copying my life, ISN, to someone else at all? What if there's a reason I can remember those missing hours? What if the killer who left those journals for me to find was showing me a mirror, not a threat? So here is my question for you. If you discovered evidence that you might be responsible for terrible things you have no memory of doing, would you turn yourself in to be sure, or would you run from the truth and hope you read wrong? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 2. ID Phantom. The disappearance of Ray Gricard. What happens when someone learns a secret so terrifying that powerful forces erase them from existence? I know, because I found what Ray Gricard discovered before he vanished, and now the same darkness that swallowed him is hunting me. The horrifying truth is that some mysteries in America are meant to be solved, and the people who try simply disappear into the void. I am a private investigator from Pittsburgh, 46 years old, specializing in cold cases that law enforcement has abandoned. My name is Michael Reeves, and 3 months ago, a woman hired me to investigate what happened to her uncle, Ray Gricard, the district attorney who vanished without a trace in April 2005. Everyone knows the basics. He drove east on Interstate 80, told his girlfriend he was going for a drive, and never came home. His car was found in Lewisburg. His laptop was pulled from the Susquehanna River, the hard drive missing. No body, no evidence, no answers for almost 20 years. What nobody knows is what I found. What I am about to tell you will change how you see every unexplained disappearance in Pennsylvania. Every case where someone drives away and reality simply swallows them whole. The investigation started normally enough. I reviewed old case files, interviewed people who knew Gricard, traced his final movements. The official theories ranged from suicide to starting a new life abroad. But nothing fit. Gricard was dedicated to his work, respected in Center County, with no indication of depression or plans to flee. And then there was his laptop, deliberately destroyed and dumped in the river. Someone wanted to erase what he'd been researching. I spent weeks digging through his old cases, looking for anything that might have made him a target. That's when I discovered something chilling. In the months before his disappearance, Gricard had been investigating a series of missing persons cases along the Interstate 80 corridor. 17 people over 12 years, all vanishing from rest stops and truck stops between Brookville and Bloomsburg. Different ages, different backgrounds, no connection except the highway and the complete absence of evidence. The disturbing pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Every disappearance happened on foggy nights. Every victim's car was found with the driver's door open, keys in the ignition, engine running. And every scene included one creepy detail that investigating officers noted but couldn't explain. A smell like burning copper hanging in the air, and patches of frost on the ground despite warm temperatures. Gricard had compiled a file on these cases, connecting dots that nobody else saw. He interviewed witnesses who reported seeing strange lights hovering over the highway on the nights people vanished. Truckers described encounters with fog banks that appeared instantly, so thick their headlights couldn't penetrate the darkness. And multiple people mentioned a figure they'd seen standing beside the road, tall and perfectly still, watching traffic with an intensity that felt predatory and unsettling. I found Gricard's notes in a storage unit his girlfriend didn't know existed. He'd been tracking something he called the ID Phantom, an entity or presence that hunted along the highway, selecting victims according to patterns he was still trying to understand. His final entry, dated 3 days before he disappeared, sent ice through my veins. He figured out the pattern. He knew when and where the next disappearance would occur, and he planned to be there, to finally see what was taking people. That location was a rest stop outside Lewisburg, the same town where his car was found. I should have taken the file to the state police. Instead, driven by the same curiosity that probably killed Gricard, I decided to investigate the rest stop myself. I told myself I was being careful, that I just observed from a distance. But the truth is, I was already hooked by the mystery, already stepping into the same trap that had claimed 17 others. The rest stop sat at mile marker 178, a standard facility with bathrooms, vending machines, and a parking area for trucks. I arrived at dusk on a Thursday in late October, when Gricard's notes predicted the next incident would occur. The sky was clear when I pulled in, but within 20 minutes, Fog began rolling across the highway like something alive and purposeful. It wasn't normal fog. This was thick and gray, with an oily quality that made my skin crawl. It moved against the wind, flowing uphill, gathering around the rest stop in swirling patterns. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes. My breath came out in clouds of vapor, and frost started forming on my windshield despite the car's heater running full blast. That's when I saw the figure. It stood at the edge of the parking area, barely visible through the eerie fog. Tall, maybe 7 feet, with proportions that seemed subtly wrong. Too thin, limbs too long, head tilted at an angle that suggested something broken inside. It didn't move, just stood there watching the handful of vehicles in the lot with an attention that felt intelligent and calculating. I grabbed my camera and started recording. Through the lens, I could see details invisible to the naked eye. The figure's surface seemed to shift and ripple like heat waves rising from asphalt. Where it stood, the fog swirled in geometric patterns, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly. And behind it, barely perceptible in the darkness, I saw more figures. Dozens of them, emerging from the tree line, converging on the rest stop with synchronized movement. A semi-truck pulled into the lot. The driver, a woman in her 50s, climbed out and headed toward the restrooms. She walked right past the figures without seeing them, her breath fogging in the unnatural cold. I wanted to scream a warning, but fear paralyzed my vocal cords. I could only watch as the fog thickened around her, cutting her off from view. When the fog cleared 30 seconds later, she was gone. Her truck sat with the door open, engine running, keys dangling from the ignition. The only trace of her existence was that terrible smell of burning copper and patches of frost spreading across the concrete where she'd been standing. The figures turned toward my car in unison. Every single one focused on me with an awareness that made my blood freeze. They knew I'd witnessed the abduction. They knew I was recording. And in that horrifying moment, I understood what had happened to Rhaegar Carr. He'd seen this too. He documented it. And they'd taken him to protect their secret. I threw the car into reverse and floored it, tires screaming as I fishtailed onto the highway. The fog pursued, flowing after me like a living thing, tendrils reaching for my bumper. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figures standing on the road, watching my escape with what felt like amusement. They weren't worried. They knew I couldn't outrun them forever. I drove 90 miles an hour through the night, taking random exits, doubling back, trying to lose whatever was following me. But the fog kept appearing ahead of me on the highway, forcing me to take detours deeper into rural Pennsylvania. My phone lost signal. My GPS stopped working. I was being herded, pushed toward a destination I couldn't see but could feel waiting in the darkness. Finally, exhausted and terrified, I pulled into a motel outside Lock Haven. The Night Owl Motor Lodge, a rundown place that probably should have been condemned decades ago. The desk clerk, an old man with rheumy eyes, barely looked at me as he handed over a key. He asked if I'd seen the fog, said it had been appearing more frequently over the past few weeks, always before someone went missing. He lived in the area for 70 years and remembered when it started back in the early 90s, right after the state upgraded that section of Interstate 80. He told me about the construction crew that had disappeared while working the night shift. 12 men who simply vanished between midnight and dawn, leaving their equipment running and no evidence of where they'd gone. The company covered it up, blamed labor disputes and workers quitting. But locals knew better. They'd seen the lights in the sky, heard the humming sound that made their teeth ache, watched the fog roll in with geometric precision. The creepy old man leaned close and whispered that the highway was built wrong. Not structurally, but dimensionally. The engineers had accidentally created a thin place, a section of road that existed partially in another space. And something on the other side had noticed. It had been crossing over ever since, hunting along the corridor, taking people back to wherever it came from. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. Around 3 a.m, I heard the humming, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the motel walls and into my bones. I looked out the window and saw the fog rolling across the parking lot, those familiar geometric patterns swirling within it. And standing in the fog were the figures, dozens of them, surrounding the motel in a perfect circle. They didn't approach. They just stood there, waiting with infinite patience, and I knew with chilling certainty that they were giving me a choice. I could run again, and they follow, herding me toward whatever fate they planned. Or I could give them what they wanted. The camera, the evidence, my silence. I smashed the camera with a chair leg, destroying the memory card, erasing the footage of the abduction. The moment I finished, the humming stopped. The fog began to dissipate. The figures faded back into darkness, vanishing as completely as they appeared. But I knew they were still watching, waiting to see if I honor our unspoken agreement. That was 3 months ago. I told my client I couldn't find any new information about her uncle's disappearance. I returned Grikar's files to the storage unit and walked away from the case. But the horror hasn't left me. I see those figures in my peripheral vision, standing at the edges of parking lots, watching from highway overpasses. The fog follows me, appearing on clear nights as a reminder of what I witnessed and what I agreed to keep secret. They researched other disappearances along Interstate 80 since then, finding dozens more cases that match the pattern. The FBI knows something is happening but can't explain it. Local law enforcement files reports and closes cases as unsolved. And people keep vanishing, one every few months, taken by something that uses America's highway system as hunting grounds. The most disturbing discovery came last week. I found a video online, posted anonymously, showing strange lights over Interstate 80 near the same rest stop. The footage was shaky and brief, but in the final seconds, you could see a figure standing beside the road. Tall, impossibly thin, watching traffic pass with that same predatory attention. The video had been viewed 17,000 times before it was taken down, flagged for violating community guidelines that made no sense. Someone is trying to warn people, maybe one of the other witnesses who escaped, maybe someone who lost a loved one and figured out the truth. But their efforts are being suppressed, their evidence deleted, their voices silenced by forces that want this nightmare kept hidden from public knowledge. I think about Ray Gricar often, about how close he came to exposing this horror before they erased him. His laptop in the river, his hard drive missing, his body never found. Did they take him like the others? Or did they do something worse? Did they make an example of him? A warning to anyone else who might dig too deep into the mystery? And I wonder about the people who were taken. Are they still alive somewhere? In that other space where the figures exist? Are they stored like specimens, studied and cataloged? Or is their fate something even more terrifying? Something our minds couldn't comprehend even if we saw it directly? The fear is constant now, a weight in my chest that never lifts. I've become paranoid, checking my surroundings constantly, avoiding Interstate 80 entirely, taking surface roads that add hours to every trip. Because I know they were still watching me, still waiting to see if I'll break our agreement and try to tell someone what I saw. So here is what I need to ask you, and I need you to think very carefully about your answer before you write it in the comments. Have you ever driven Interstate 80 through Pennsylvania and experienced unexplained fog, missing time, or seen something standing beside the road that filled you with inexplicable dread? Because if you have, you might have encountered the same thing that took Ray Gricar and 17 others. And the terrifying question is this: how many more people have to vanish before someone with power finally acknowledges that something impossible is hunting on America's highways? Story 3. Shattuck Fiddler Mansion. The rope burns on my wrists appeared 3 nights ago, and I've never touched a rope in my life. They identical to the marks found on Rebecca Zahao's body in 2011, down to the precise width and pattern. And I've been dreaming about a mansion in Lancaster, Pennsylvania that I've never visited, where a woman in white keeps pointing at the balcony and mouthing the word help. What happens when a spirit follows you home from a place you've never been? What kind of terrifying connection can form between the living and the dead across 3,000 miles in 13 years? My name is Jennifer Hayes, and I am a forensic psychologist who specializes in reviewing cold cases. Last month, I was hired to conduct a psychological autopsy on Rebecca Zahao, the woman found hanging from a balcony in a California mansion under circumstances so disturbing that the case has haunted investigators for over a decade. Her death was ruled a suicide, but the evidence never made sense. Bound hands, bound feet, a cryptic message painted on a door, and a family that insisted she would never take her own life. I spent 3 weeks reviewing every detail of that horrifying case, and somewhere in that process, something attached itself to me. Something that has been trying to communicate ever since. Something that was growing more desperate and more dangerous with each passing day. The dreams started immediately after I began the case review. Every night, the same terrifying vision. I am standing in front of a massive Victorian mansion with dark stone walls and a tower that stretches toward a gray sky. The architecture is distinctly Pennsylvania Dutch, with ornate woodwork and stained glass windows that seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. And in every window, I see her, Rebecca, still and pale, watching me with eyes that pled for something I'd done. Do you understand? The mansion felt familiar in that unsettling way dreams sometimes do, like I'd been there before in another life. But I'd never seen it during my waking hours. Had no idea where it was or why my subconscious kept returning to this specific building. Then came the physical manifestations. I'd wake up with mud on my feet, though I'd gone to bed with clean sheets. Find my clothes rearranged in patterns I didn't recognize. Discover my office files scattered across the floor in configurations that looked deliberate, like someone was trying to spell something. My colleagues at the Forensic Institute noticed changes in my behavior. I became obsessed with the Zahau case, working 18-hour days, refusing to move on to other assignments. The details consumed me. The rope, the knots, the message painted on the door in black paint. She saved him. Can you save her? That message was supposedly written by Rebecca herself before she died, a cryptic note about the young boy who had fallen down the stairs days before her death. But something about it never sat right with me. The phrasing was wrong. The psychology didn't match. And the more I studied it, the more I became convinced it wasn't a suicide note at all. It was a clue, a desperate message from someone who knew she was about to die. 3 weeks into my investigation, I received an anonymous email with a single attachment. A photograph of a mansion, the same mansion from my dreams. And beneath the image, an address, 1244 Columbia Avenue, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The Shattuck Fiddler Mansion. I researched it immediately. The building had a dark history stretching back over a century. Originally built in 1894 by a wealthy industrialist, it had passed through multiple owners, each reporting strange occurrences. Phantom footsteps, doors that locked from the inside, and most disturbing, sightings of a woman in white standing on the second-floor balcony, looking down at the street as if waiting for someone. But here is what made my blood run cold. Rebecca Zahau had visited this mansion 6 months before her death. She had been in Lancaster on business, and according to local paranormal investigators, she had taken a tour of the supposedly haunted building. Multiple witnesses remembered her because she had become visibly distressed during the visit, claiming she felt watched, claiming she saw someone in the mirrors who wasn't there. When she left, she told the tour guide something chilling. "This place knows how I'm going to die." 6 months later, she was found hanging from a balcony in California, bound hand and foot, under circumstances that perfectly matched the most famous ghost story associated with the Shattuck Fiddler Mansion. In 1912, a woman named Catherine Fiddler had been found dead in the mansion under nearly identical conditions. Hanging from the second-floor balcony, hands and feet bound, a message carved into the wooden floor, "He made me fall." Catherine's death was ruled a suicide. Her husband, a prominent businessman, was never charged despite widespread suspicion. The case went cold, and Catherine became the mansion's most famous ghost. I had to see the place for myself. I booked a flight to Pennsylvania and arrived in Lancaster on a gray October afternoon when the whole city seemed wrapped in fog. The mansion stood on a quiet residential street, looming over the neighboring houses like a dark sentinel. It was exactly as I'd seen it in my dreams, down to the Gothic revival details and the iron fence surrounding the property. Current owners had converted the building into a bed and breakfast, capitalizing on its haunted reputation. I checked in under a false name, not wanting anyone to know a forensic psychologist was investigating their ghost stories. My room was on the 3rd floor, directly above the infamous balcony where Catherine Fiddler had died over a century ago. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, but instantly, like walking into a freezer. The innkeeper noticed my reaction and smiled apologetically, explaining that the heating system was old and temperamental. But I knew better. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was something else. My room was decorated in period furniture, all dark wood and heavy fabrics. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, and above it hung a mirror in an ornate gilded frame. I set down my bags and immediately felt that sensation of being watched. Not from the room itself, but from the mirror. When I looked directly at it, I saw only my own reflection. But in my peripheral vision, I swear I saw someone else. A woman with long dark hair, wearing white. Night fell quickly. I tried to work, reviewing my case notes on Rebecca's death, looking for connections to Catherine Fiddler, a century-old tragedy. The similarities were too precise to be coincidental. Both women had been found with the same type of rope burns. Both had messages associated with their deaths that seemed to implicate someone else. Both had died in wealthy households where they didn't quite belong, where their deaths were conveniently ruled suicides despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I opened the door to investigate and found the corridor empty. But at the far end, near the stairs, I saw wet footprints on the hardwood floor. Small prints, like a woman's bare feet, leading from the balcony door to my room. I followed them. The prints were fresh, glistening in the dim light. They led me downstairs to the second floor, then out onto the balcony where Catherine Fiddler had died. The October wind was bitter cold, cutting through my jacket. And there, standing at the railing, I saw her. Not a shadow, not a trick of light. A solid figure in a white dress, her back to me, her long dark hair moving in the wind. She was looking down at the street below, her posture one of absolute despair. And as I watched, frozen in terror, she turned her head slightly. Not enough to see her face, but enough for me to hear her whisper something that made my heart stop. "Help me, help us both." The voice was Rebecca. I did listen to dozens of audio recordings during my investigation, studied her speech patterns, her accent. This was her voice coming from a figure dressed like Catherine Fiddler from 1912. I stumbled backward into the mansion and slammed the balcony door. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely turn the lock. When I looked through the glass, the figure was gone, but written in the condensation on the window, as if traced by a finger from the outside, were 3 words: "He killed us." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room with every light on, researching everything I could find about the mansion, its history. And I discovered something that changed everything. Something that explained the terrifying connection between 2 women who died a century apart. Catherine Fiddler, his husband, the man suspected but never charged in her death, had a great-grandson. A man who made his fortune in pharmaceutical shipping and real estate development in California. A man who owned the mansion where Rebecca Zahow died in 2011. The same family, the same pattern of violence, the same method of covering it up. Rebecca must have realized this connection during her visit to Lancaster. Must have understood that she was living in a house owned by the descendant of a man who had literally gotten away with murder. And when she tried to investigate, when she started asking questions, she became the second victim in a legacy of violence spanning 4 generations. I gathered all my evidence and prepared to leave the mansion at first light. But around 3 in the morning, I heard my door handle turning. I locked it from the inside, thrown the deadbolt. But the mechanism clicked anyway, and the door swung slowly open. Catherine Fiddler stood in the doorway, or the thing that had been Catherine Fiddler. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black holes that seemed to absorb all light. She raised one hand and pointed at me, and I felt invisible fingers close around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The room spun as pressure built in my head, and I understood with absolute certainty that this was how they both died. Not hanging, strangled first, then staged to look like suicide. The rope burns were post-mortem. The binding was theatrical. The real cause of death was manual strangulation, and the spirit of Catherine Fiddler was showing me exactly how it felt. My vision started to go dark. I thought I was dying, but then I heard Rebecca's voice again, clear and strong. "Tell them. Tell everyone. Don, let him bury us again." The pressure released. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When I looked up, both figures were gone, but on my laptop screen, my case file had been opened to a specific page. An autopsy photo of Rebecca Zahow showing her neck, where the coroner had noted minor bruising inconsistent with hanging. Bruising that looked like finger marks. Evidence that had been dismissed as post-mortem artifact. Evidence that proved she'd been strangled before being hung from that balcony. I left the Shattuck Fiddler mansion at dawn and drove straight to the Lancaster Police Department. I filed a report about everything I experienced, everything I discovered. They were skeptical at first, but when I showed them my research connecting the 2 families, connecting the two deaths. They agreed to forward my findings to the California authorities handling Rebecca's case. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, new evidence has emerged. A witness who saw a man leaving the California mansion the night Rebecca died. Financial records showing the family had motive to silence her. DNA evidence that was never properly tested. The case is being reopened as a homicide investigation. But the hauntings haven't stopped. Rebecca still visits my dreams, though now she is smiling instead of pleading. And the rope burns on my wrists have faded, replaced by something else. A single word written on my bathroom mirror in condensation every morning. Thank you. I carry the weight of their stories now. 2 women killed a century apart by men who thought their wealth and power put them above justice. 2 women who became ghosts because they couldn't rest until someone heard the truth. The Shattuck Fiddler Mansion still operates as a bed and breakfast, but the sightings have changed. Instead of 1 woman in white, witnesses now report seeing 2. Standing together on the balcony, looking not down at the street, but up at the sky. Finally at peace, finally free. So here, it's my question for you. If a ghost asked you to solve their murder, knowing it would put you in danger from powerful people who they covered up their crimes for generations, would you help them find justice, or would you walk away to protect yourself? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 4. Boy in the Box. America. This unknown child. What if I told you that some murders leave wounds in reality itself, creating haunted spaces where the dead refuse to rest? I know this is true because they felt the presence of America, this unknown child, and what happened to me in the woods of Northeast Philadelphia will terrify you more than any ghost story they ever heard. The chilling truth is that some victims never stop crying out for justice, even 60 years after their death. I am a documentary filmmaker from Baltimore, 39 years old, and I've spent the last 2 years researching cold cases for a true crime series. The Boy in the Box drew me in like nothing else. In February 1957, a college student checking muskrat traps found a cardboard box in the woods off Susquehanna Road. Inside was the naked body of a small boy, maybe 4 years old, wrapped in a blanket. Someone had beaten him severely, cut his hair in a crude, uneven style, and dumped him like garbage in the darkness. Nobody ever identified him, despite massive publicity, forensic analysis, and decades of investigation. He remained nameless. They buried him as America, this unknown child, and a potter, S. Field, gave him a headstone that read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." And for almost 70 years, he is waited in the ground, his identity lost, his killer never caught, his story unsolved and deeply disturbing. I thought I'd make a respectful documentary, interview the investigators who worked the case, visit the discovery site, maybe generate new leads. What I didn't expect was to experience something so terrifying that it shattered my understanding of death and what comes after. The woods are still there, surprisingly unchanged despite urban development surrounding the area. Fox Chase, a neighborhood in northeast Philly, where row houses and strip malls press against a thin strip of forest that nobody wants to develop. Local legend says the land is cursed, that contractors who try to build there experience equipment failures, accidents, and an overwhelming sense of dread that drives workers away. I arrived on a gray November afternoon, camera equipment loaded in my backpack, planning to shoot some atmospheric footage. The moment I stepped off Susquehanna Road into the trees, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath fogged in the cold air, and an eerie silence fell over everything. No traffic sounds despite being 50 yards from a busy street. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but oppressive quiet that pressed against my eardrums. The discovery site is marked by a memorial, a small plaque, and some weathered flowers left by people who still care about the unknown child. I set up my camera and started filming, describing the history of the case, the horrifying details of the murder, the decades of failed investigation. That's when I heard the crying, soft at first, almost inaudible. A child, his sob, broken and desperate, coming from deeper in the woods. I called out, thinking maybe a lost kid had wandered into the forest. No response, just continued crying that seemed to move, circling my position, staying just out of sight in the shadows between the trees. The rational part of my brain insisted I was hearing things, that grief and atmosphere were playing tricks on my mind. But the fear crawling up my spine knew better. This was something else, something impossible and deeply wrong. I checked my camera's audio meters and felt my blood freeze. They were spiking, recording sound levels that matched what I was hearing. This wasn't the imagination. Something was crying in those woods, and my equipment was capturing it. I followed the sound, moving deeper into the forest, away from the memorial and the safety of the road. The trees grew denser, their bare branches creating a canopy that blocked what little light remained. The crying grew louder, more anguished, punctuated by sounds that made me want to run. The thud of fists hitting flesh. A child. His voice pleading in words I couldn't quite make out. And underneath it all, a low humming that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. I found a clearing where the undergrowth had died, leaving bare earth in a perfect circle. In the center sat an old cardboard box, weathered and partially collapsed but clearly deliberate in its placement. Nobody leaves boxes in the middle of the woods by accident. This was a message, or a recreation, or something far more disturbing. The crying stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, heavy with presence and malice. I felt eyes watching from every direction, studying me with an intelligence that felt both childlike and ancient. My camera's battery died despite being fully charged minutes earlier. The temperature plummeted further, and frost began spreading across the ground in geometric patterns that formed shapes I recognized from the crime scene photos. The positions the boy's body had been found in, recreated in ice at my feet. I ran. Professional curiosity and documentary ambitions evaporated in the face of pure terror. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the undergrowth, desperate to reach the road and escape whatever haunted presence filled those woods. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Small, quick, the sound of a child running. But they weren't receding. They were keeping pace, staying exactly 10 feet behind no matter how fast I moved. I burst onto Susquehanna Road, gasping and bleeding from scratches, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would explode. Traffic flowed past, normal and mundane, completely oblivious to the nightmare I just escaped. I looked back at the tree line and saw him, a small figure standing in the shadows, watching me with dark eyes that held no innocence, only accusation and rage. He was maybe 4 years old, naked, his hair cut in that distinctive uneven style from the crime scene photos. Bruises covered his thin body, and his expression conveyed an anger so intense it felt physical, pressing against me like a wave of heat. Then he raised one small hand and pointed directly at me, a gesture that felt like a condemnation, and vanished into the darkness between the trees. I should have gone straight home and forgotten the whole project. Instead, driven by some combination of professional obligation and morbid obsession, I started researching paranormal reports from the area. What I found was deeply unsettling. Dozens of people over the decades had reported similar encounters. Hikers hearing children crying in the woods. Joggers seeing a small naked boy standing at the tree line. Construction workers feeling watched by something that radiated hostility and grief. And more disturbing, several people who spent time near the discovery site reported experiencing vivid nightmares afterward. Dreams where they relived the murder from different perspectives. Some saw it through the killer's eyes, feeling the rage and madness that drove someone to beat a child to death. Others experienced it from the victim's perspective, feeling every blow, every moment of terror, the final abandonment in the cold darkness. All of them woke screaming, and all of them said the same chilling thing. The boy wanted them to know, wanted them to understand what had been done to him. I tried to dismiss these accounts as urban legend and shared delusion. Then the nightmares started for me too. Every night for 2 weeks, I dreamed of the murder. I saw hands striking a small body, heard a child's screams, felt the weight of the box being carried through dark woods. But more terrifying were the fragments of memory that didn't match the known facts. Images of a house with specific details, a woman's face twisted with rage, a room with distinctive wallpaper and furniture. These weren't generic nightmare images. They felt like memories, like the boy was showing me what happened to him. I started documenting everything, sketching what I saw in the dreams, writing down every detail no matter how small. The house had a specific style of porch railing. The wallpaper showed a pattern of roses and vines. The woman wore her hair in a particular style popular in the 1950s. And the location felt specific, somewhere in the suburbs northwest of Philadelphia, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Other researchers who who worked the case reported similar dreams over the years. Some had even produced sketches that matched mine with horrifying accuracy. The boy was communicating, showing multiple people the same images, desperate to finally be identified and his killers brought to justice even though they were almost certainly dead by now. The creepy encounters escalated. I started seeing the boy in my waking life, standing at the end of my street at dusk, watching from the window of an abandoned building. Always distant, always silent, always pointing that accusatory finger. And everywhere he appeared, the temperature dropped, frost formed, and that terrible humming vibrated through the air. I contacted a psychic who specialized in murder cases, desperate for any explanation that made sense. She agreed to visit the woods with me to try and communicate with whatever presence haunted that place. What happened there convinced me that some horrors transcend death and create permanent scars in the fabric of reality. We arrived at midnight under a full moon that turned the forest silver and eerie. The psychic walked directly to the memorial without hesitation, as if drawn by invisible strings. She stood in silence for several minutes, then began trembling violently. Tears streamed down her face, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't to hers. High and young, the voice of a 4-year-old boy, speaking words that broke my heart. He said his name. After 67 years of being unknown, he finally spoke his identity. But before the psychic could repeat it clearly, she collapsed, unconscious and bleeding from her nose. The woods erupted with activity. The crying returned, louder than before, coming from every direction at once. Shadows moved between the trees, taking forms that resembled people but moved all wrong, jerky and unnatural. And the boy appeared in the clearing, closer than I'd ever seen him, close enough to see the damage that had been done to his small body, the evidence of abuse and neglect and finally murder. He pointed at me again, and this time I understood. He wasn't accusing me. He was choosing me, asking me to be his voice, to tell his story, to keep searching for his identity and the justice he'd been denied. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, a burden I didn't want but couldn't refuse. The psychic recovered but remembered nothing from her trance. She refused to return to the woods and stopped taking my calls when I tried to follow up. I was left alone with the sketches, the memories from nightmares, and a growing obsession with solving a case that had defeated professional investigators for nearly 7 decades. I spent the last 6 months following the leads from my dreams, searching property records for houses matching the architectural details, looking through old newspapers for missing children who were never reported, interviewing elderly residents who might remember suspicious activity from the 1950s. The work is exhausting and often leads nowhere, but I can't stop. Because the boy won. Let me stop. He appears in my apartment now, standing at the foot of my bed in the early morning hours before dawn. Never threatening, just watching, waiting, reminding me of my promise. And the nightmares continue, each one revealing new details, new clues, fragments of a story that someone worked very hard to erase from history. The most chilling revelation came 2 weeks ago. I found a woman in a nursing home who recognized my sketches. She lived in the neighborhood in 1957 and remembered a family that suddenly left town right around the time of the murder. A family with a small boy who had never been enrolled in school, who neighbors rarely saw, who seemed to exist in the shadows of that household. She gave me names, addresses, connections that investigators at the time never pursued because nobody reported the child missing. I'm close now. I can feel it. The boy, his identity is within reach, hidden in dusty records and fading memories, waiting to be uncovered. But I am also terrified of what I'll find, and what happens when the mystery is finally solved. Will the haunting end? Will the boy, his spirit finally rest? Or is the horror permanent, etched into those woods forever regardless of whether justice is ever served? What I know for certain is that some crimes are so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that they tear holes in reality itself. The boy in the box ISN to just an unsolved murder. It is a wound that never healed, a wrong that demands correction, a voice that refuses to be silenced by death or time or the deliberate erasure of identity. So here is what I need to ask you, and I want you to think carefully before answering in the comments. If you've ever been to those woods off Susquehanna Road in Northeast Philadelphia, have you felt something watching you? Have you heard a child crying when no children were present? Have you experienced dreams or visions about a small boy desperate to tell you his name? Because if you have, you might be part of this too, chosen to help give voice to America, this unknown child, and finally bring him the justice and peace he has been seeking for almost 70 years in the darkness. Story 5. Tunnels that never end. What if I told you there are abandoned highway tunnels beneath Pennsylvania where reality breaks down, where drivers from the 1960s are still trying to find their way out, and where something called the Blue Mist has been collecting souls for over 60 years? Because I drove through those tunnels last week, and I'm not sure I ever really made it back out. My name is Rachel, and I am a long-haul trucker who has driven every major highway from Maine to California. I've seen it all: ice storms, fog banks, deer crossings at midnight, and nothing has ever truly scared me on the road. But the abandoned Pennsylvania Turnpike tunnels changed that. Changed everything. Now I'm not even sure if I'm still alive or if I'm just another ghost trapped in that endless darkness, driving the same stretch of forgotten highway over and over for eternity. It started 3 weeks ago when my regular route got detoured due to construction. My GPS glitched out near Breezewood, showing roads that shouldn't exist, exit numbers that made no sense. I pulled over at a rest stop to recalibrate, and that is when I met the old man pumping gas into a vintage pickup truck that looked like it hadn't been manufactured since 1975. He noticed my confusion, asked where I was headed, and when I mentioned trying to get back to the main turnpike, his face went pale. He warned me about the old road, the original Pennsylvania Turnpike that had been abandoned in 1968 when they built the new highway. Specifically, he warned me about the tunnels. 7 of them, carved through the mountains in the 1940s, each one over a mile long, and all of them sealed off and left to rot after the new road opened. But people still found ways in, he said, urban explorers and thrill seekers who wanted to walk through history. Most of them came back. Some didn't. And the ones who did return were never quite right afterward. Like something in those tunnels had taken a piece of them and replaced it with darkness. I thanked him for the warning and ignored it completely. I'm practical, rational, and I needed to make up time. When my GPS showed a shortcut that looked like it might connect to the old turnpike route, I took it without hesitation. Big mistake. The biggest, most horrifying mistake of my entire life. The road was in worse shape than I expected. Cracked asphalt overrun with weeds, faded lane markers barely visible in my headlights. It was past midnight, November cold seeping through my truck, this heater, fog rolling across the highway in thick sheets that swallowed everything beyond 20 feet. I should have turned around. Every instinct screamed at me to reverse course and find another route. But I'm stubborn and proud, and I convinced myself I could handle whatever condition this road was in. Then I saw the tunnel entrance looming out of the fog like the mouth of some massive predator, and my heart stopped. This wasn't just an abandoned tunnel. This was Sidling Hill, the longest and most infamous of the old turnpike tunnels, over a mile of darkness carved through solid mountain. The entrance had been sealed with concrete barriers in 1968, but those barriers were gone now, moved or demolished or simply vanished, leaving the tunnel gaping open and waiting. I should stop. Should they turned around right there and driven away from that disturbing black hole leading into the mountain. But my truck was already committed to the turn, momentum carrying me forward, and before I could react I was inside, swallowed by absolute darkness that my headlights barely penetrated. The tunnel was wrong immediately, not just abandoned and creepy, but fundamentally wrong in ways that made my brain hurt trying to process. The walls were covered in graffiti, tags, and messages that shouldn't have been possible because nobody had legal access to this place. But worse than the graffiti were the other messages, scratched deep into the concrete with desperate fingernails or maybe something sharper. Help us. We can find the exit. It's been days. We're still driving. Don, stop or I will see you. My speedometer read 55, but the tunnel seemed endless, stretching on far longer than a mile. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20. And I was still surrounded by crumbling concrete walls and suffocating darkness. My radio started picking up phantom stations, broadcasts from the 1960s, traffic reports for highways that had been torn down decades ago, emergency announcements about accidents that had happened before I was born. That's when I saw the first car, a Chevrolet Impala from maybe 1967, driving ahead of me with its taillights glowing red, maintaining exactly 55 miles per hour no matter how much I accelerated or slowed down. I could see people inside, shadows of heads and shoulders, a family from another era still driving this route like the new turnpike had never been built and they'd never been given a reason to leave. More cars appeared, emerging from side passages I hadn't noticed before. Vintage vehicles from the 1950s and 60s joining a growing convoy of ghost drivers, all heading in the same direction, all maintaining the same eerie speed, all trapped in this nightmare tunnel that refused to end. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, my breath coming in panicked gasps that fogged my windshield. I tried honking my horn, but the sound was swallowed by the tunnel, absorbed into the concrete like the darkness was eating it. Then I saw the blue mist, the legendary ghost of Sidling Hill, the phenomenon that had terrified drivers on the original turnpike for years before they finally shut it down. It appeared ahead of me in the tunnel, a glowing blue fog that moved against the direction of traffic, drifting through the convoy of ghost cars like smoke through a graveyard. Where it touched each vehicle, the taillights flickered and dimmed, and I swear I could hear screaming, faint and distant, the sound of people realizing they were dead and had been dead for decades. The mist rolled toward my truck with horrible purpose. I slammed on my brakes, my rig jackknifing in the narrow tunnel, tires screeching against pavement that felt soft and wrong beneath my wheels. The convoy of ghost cars didn't stop, didn't even slow down. They just drove through my truck like I wasn't there. Their vehicles passing through solid metal on me without any resistance, each one leaving behind a whisper of their last thoughts. Lost. So lost. Can you find the light? Been driving so long. Please let it end. The blue mist surrounded my truck, pressing against the windows with curiosity or hunger or something I couldn't identify. It wasn't just fog. Inside that glowing blue cloud, I could see faces, dozens of them, people who died in these tunnels over the decades. Car accidents, breakdowns, heart attacks, all the ways people can die alone in the dark when help is too far away and nobody knows you. Missing. They become part of the tunnel, absorbed into whatever supernatural phenomenon haunted this forgotten stretch of highway, condemned to drive this route eternally or drift through it as formless mist searching for the exit they never find. The worst part was recognizing some of them. Missing persons cases I heard about on the news, urban explorers who vanished in these tunnels, truckers like me who taken a wrong turn and disappeared without a trace. They pressed against my windows, their transparent faces showing confusion and desperation and a slow realization that they were no longer alive, that they crossed some threshold between reality and nightmare and couldn't find their way back. One face stood out from all the others, a woman around my age, wearing a trucker's cap identical to mine, staring at me with recognition and terror in her eyes. She looked exactly like me. Same features, same build, same everything. And I understood with horrible clarity that I was looking at myself, at what I would become if I didn't escape this tunnel. A ghost trapped here for decades, still driving the same route, still hoping for an exit that didn't exist. I screamed and floored the accelerator, my truck lurching forward through the blue mist with all the desperate power I could force from the engine. The ghost version of myself reached through the windshield, her hand passing through the glass, fingers stretching toward my face with urgent purpose. I felt her touch like ice and electricity, felt her memories flooding into my mind. Years of driving this tunnel, decades of searching for an exit, the slow erosion of hope and sanity until all that remained was the mechanical act of steering and accelerating and believing that maybe the next minute would be the one when the tunnel finally ended. I drove faster, pushing my truck beyond safe speeds, the walls blurring past in my peripheral vision. More vehicles appeared around me, not just cars from the past but trucks, motorcycles, even horse-drawn carriages from when this route was just a dirt road through the mountains. Every era of transportation was represented here, every traveler who ever gotten lost in these passages, all of them trapped in a temporal loop where past and present and future collapsed into an eternal now of driving and searching and never arriving. The tunnel branched ahead of me, splitting into passages that shouldn't exist, directions that made no geometric sense. Some branches sloped upward into impossible angles, others descended so steeply they seemed to drop straight down into the earth. Ghost cars turned into each passage randomly, their drivers making choices they hoped would lead to freedom but that only took them deeper into the maze. I chose the center passage, the one that looked most like a normal highway tunnel, and prayed I was making the right decision. The darkness grew thicker, more oppressive, pressing against my truck like a physical force trying to crush me. My headlights dimmed, then failed completely, leaving me driving blind through absolute blackness, navigating by instinct and desperation. Then suddenly, impossibly, I burst out into night air, my truck careening onto a stretch of old highway under a sky full of stars. I slammed the brakes, spinning to a stop on gravel and weeds, my heart hammering so violently I thought I'd have a heart attack. Behind me, the tunnel entrance was gone. Not sealed, not hidden, just gone, replaced by solid mountain face like it had never existed. I checked my phone, my GPS, my dashboard clock. According to every device I owned, I'd been in that tunnel for 4 hours, but my fuel gauge showed I'd burned through a full tank, enough diesel to drive 500 miles. Time had broken down in there, stretched and compressed simultaneously, and I had no idea how long I'd really been trapped in that horrifying darkness. 3 days later, I'm still not sure I escaped. Strange things keep happening. My GPS shows the tunnel route randomly, disappearing when I try to document it. I see ghost cars on every highway now, vintage vehicles that vanish when I look directly at them. And every night, I dream I am back in Sidling Hill, back in that endless tunnel, still driving, still searching, still trapped with all the others who took a wrong turn and never found their way home. The terrifying possibility haunts me constantly. What if I never made it out? What if I'm still in there, and everything since, this apartment, this life, this story I am telling you, is just my dying brain, this last desperate fantasy as I become another face in the blue mist. What if you, re-listening to a ghost right now, a confession from someone who died in those tunnels and doesn't even know it yet? So here is my question for you, and I desperately need your answer in the comments. If you were driving alone at night and your GPS showed a shortcut through an abandoned tunnel that could save you hours, knowing the stories, knowing the danger, would you take the risk? Or would you accept the delay and stay on the safe, traveled roads even if it cost you time and money? Tell me what you choose, because I need to know if I'm the only one foolish enough to drive into darkness, or if we're all just one wrong turn away from our own personal nightmare that never ends. Story 6. Black Dog of Lehigh Gorge. The dog appeared on the tracks exactly 3 minutes before the train derailed. Massive and black as oil, with eyes that glowed like hot coals in the darkness. 17 people died that night, and every single survivor reported seeing the same terrifying creature moments before the crash. They call it the Black Dog of Lehigh Gorge, and I know it's real because it's been following me for 3 days, and I think I'm next. What kind of horrifying omen walks on 4 legs and marks people for death? What ancient evil haunts the railroad tracks of Pennsylvania? It's Lehigh Gorge, appearing again and again before tragedy strikes, as if it feeds on the fear of those about to die. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I am a railroad safety inspector for the Northeast Regional Rail System. I investigate accidents, assess track conditions, and make sure our trains run safely through some of the most challenging terrain in America. The Lehigh Gorge route is particularly dangerous, a winding stretch of track that follows the river through a deep rocky canyon. Beautiful during the day, absolutely terrifying at night. I've worked this route for 15 years and never believed the stories. Every railroad has its legends, its ghost tales passed down by workers looking to spook the new guys. The Black Dog was just another campfire story, a creepy bit of folklore about a phantom hound that appears before disasters. Pure superstition. Until last Monday, when I saw it with my own eyes and realized some legends exist because they true. I was conducting a routine night inspection, walking a 2-mile section of track between Jim Thorpe and Whitehaven. Standard procedure: check the rails for cracks, inspect the ties, look for any signs of erosion or structural weakness. The gorge is particularly narrow in this area, with sheer rock walls rising hundreds of feet on both sides and the Lehigh River churning below. One wrong step and you're in the water. One missed crack in the rails and a train full of passengers goes over the edge. It was around 11 at night, cold for September, with fog rolling up from the river and reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. My flashlight cut through the mist in a narrow beam, illuminating the rails and the wooden ties beneath them. Everything looked solid. No issues, just another routine inspection. Then I heard the sound that made my blood freeze. Growling, low and rumbling, coming from somewhere ahead on the tracks. Not a dog, a growl. Something deeper, more primal, the kind of sound that triggers every ancient survival instinct buried in human DNA. I stopped walking and aimed my flashlight toward the noise. The beam caught something moving through the fog. A shape, large and dark, walking along the tracks directly toward me. As it emerged from the mist, my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was a dog, or something that resembled a dog, easily the size of a Great Dane, maybe larger, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red-orange light, like embers in a dying fire. And it moved wrong, not the natural loping gait of a canine, but something more deliberate, more purposeful, like it was hunting. I backed up slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the creature. Every rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. A stray dog, a trick of the fog, exhaustion playing tricks after a long shift. But the fear I felt was too intense, too visceral to be dismissed as imagination. The dog stopped about 50 feet away and sat down on the tracks. Just sat there, staring at me with those burning eyes. And I felt something that terrified me more than its appearance. Recognition. Like this thing knew me, had been looking for me specifically, had found me alone in this isolated gorge for a reason. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. I pulled it out with shaking hands and saw a text from the dispatch center. Emergency alert. Passenger train approaching on these tracks in 10 minutes. I needed to clear the inspection zone immediately. But the dog sat between me and the nearest access point. I did have to walk past it to get off the tracks in time. I started moving, keeping to the far edge of the rail bed, trying to maintain maximum distance from the creature. It watched me approach but didn't move. Didn't growl. Just sat there with that eerie stillness, tracking my movement with its glowing eyes. As I got closer, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. The dog cast no shadow, even in the direct beam of my flashlight. Its breath produced no condensation in the cold night air, and beneath its paws, the wooden railroad ties showed scorch marks, as if something intensely hot had been pressed against them. I was maybe 20 feet away when it finally moved, not toward me, but aside, stepping off the tracks to let me pass. As if granting permission, as if I passed some test. I ran, didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached the access road where my truck was parked. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Behind me, through the trees, I heard a train whistle echoing through the gorge. The passenger train, right on schedule. I was about to drive away when something made me hesitate. A terrible feeling of dread that settled over me like a heavy blanket. The same feeling I had when the dog was staring at me. A certainty that something horrifying was about to happen. I grabbed my radio and called dispatch. Told them to stop the train, to hold it at the last station. Something was wrong with the tracks. I couldn't explain how I knew. Couldn't tell them about the phantom dog without sounding insane. But I insisted they stop that train. They refused. Nothing showed up on their monitoring systems. The tracks had passed my inspection just minutes ago. The train was cleared to proceed. 3 miles down the line, at a sharp curve above the river, the train derailed. A boulder had fallen from the cliff face and landed on the tracks just seconds before the train arrived. The engineer saw it too late to stop. 5 cars went over the embankment and into the water. 17 people died, 43 injured. I was one of the first responders on scene. In the chaos of the rescue operation, 3 different survivors grabbed me and said the same chilling thing. They'd seen a huge black dog standing on the tracks just before the crash. Seen it in the train, its headlights, sitting calmly as if waiting for them. One woman swore the dog had been inside her train car right before impact, walking down the aisle, looking at specific passengers, all of whom later died. The official investigation blamed natural causes. The boulder was ruled an unfortunate accident. No way to predict or prevent it. Case closed. But I knew better. I'd seen the omen. The black dog had appeared to warn me, and I failed to stop the tragedy it foretold. That was 3 days ago. Since then, the dog has been following me. I see it everywhere, standing at the edge of my yard when I look out the kitchen window, sitting in the parking lot of my apartment building, walking along the sidewalk behind me when I go to the store. Always at a distance, always watching with those terrifying glowing eyes. Last night, I couldn't take it anymore. I researched everything I could find about the black dog legend. The stories go back over 100 years, to the earliest days of the railroad through Lehigh Gorge. Workers claimed a massive black hound haunted the tracks, appearing before cave-ins and derailments and falls. Anyone who saw it was marked for death or disaster. The legend says the dog is the spirit of a railroad worker who died in the gorge in the 1880s. He'd been inspecting tracks at night when a train came through unexpectedly. No warning whistle, no time to get clear. He was struck and killed instantly, and his faithful dog refused to leave the spot where he died. The animal stayed on the tracks, waiting for its master, until it too was struck by a train weeks later. Now they haunt the gorge together, the man and the dog, appearing to those who walk the tracks alone at night, warning of disasters, or perhaps causing them. The stories differ on whether the black dog is an omen or a harbinger, whether it predicts tragedy or summons it. I found something else in my research, a pattern. Every person who reported seeing the black dog died within 7 days. Every single one, usually in accidents related to trains, but sometimes in other ways. Car crashes, falls, house fires, as if death itself was stalking them, using whatever method was most convenient. Today is day 3. I have 4 days left if the pattern holds. I've tried everything. Called in sick to work. Stayed home with the doors locked. Avoided all trains and train tracks. But the dog still appears. This morning, I found wet paw prints on my apartment floor, leading from my front door to my bedroom. Massive prints that couldn't belong to any normal animal. And on my nightstand, I found something that made my heart stop. An old brass railroad spike, covered in rust and dirt, like it had been pulled from the tracks in the gorge. I am writing this as a warning to anyone who works on the railroads through Lehigh Gorge. If you see a massive black dog with glowing eyes while you root on the tracks at night, don't ignore it. Don't convince yourself it's nothing. Get off those tracks immediately and report what you saw, even if people think you are crazy. Because I didn't report it. I didn't sound the alarm. And 17 people died. And now the black dog has marked me. Not as a victim, but as something worse. I think it's recruiting me, turning me into another spirit that haunts those tracks. Another ghost that appears before disasters to warn or to curse or to simply bear witness to the terrible pattern of death that follows the rails through the gorge. This afternoon, I looked in the mirror and saw something that confirmed my worst fear. My eyes, they rechanging, darkening around the edges. And sometimes, just for a moment, they reflect light in a way that reminds me of those glowing red-orange eyes I saw staring at me from the fog. I tried to leave town, got in my car and started driving west, away from the gorge, away from the tracks. But 20 miles outside Jim Thorpe, my engine died. When I got out to check what was wrong, the black dog was sitting in the middle of the highway, blocking my path. It stood up as I approached and turned back toward town, back toward the gorge, and I felt my legs moving without conscious thought, following it. Being drawn back to the place where this all started. I'm in my apartment now, but I know I want to be here much longer. The dog is outside my window, 3 stories up, standing on empty air as if the laws of physics don't apply to it. It's waiting for me, calling to me in ways that have nothing to do with sound. And the terrible part is, I want to go. I want to walk those tracks again. I want to see what happens when the 7 days are up. Because I think I'm starting to understand something that terrifies me more than death itself. The black dog doesn't just predict disasters. It creates witnesses. It marks people who were supposed to die but didn't. People who saw something they shouldn't have survived seeing. And it gives them a choice. Die in 7 days, or join it. Become another spirit haunting the gorge. Another omen warning workers of dangers they ignore, just like I ignored the warning before 17 people died. Tomorrow is day 4. I have 3 days left to decide whether I fight this curse or embrace it. 3 days to figure out if I am a victim or a volunteer. 3 days before I either die or become something else entirely. Something that walks between the living and the dead. Something that marks others the way I was marked. I am going back to the gorge tonight. Back to the spot where I first saw those burning eyes staring at me through the fog. Maybe I'll find answers. Maybe I'll find an ending. Or maybe I'll just find the beginning of an eternity walking those haunted tracks, waiting to appear before the next disaster, marking the next inspector who works alone at night and doesn't believe in legends. So here is my question for you. If you were given a choice between certain death in 3 days or becoming an immortal spirit doomed to haunt the place where you died, witnessing endless tragedy but never able to prevent it, which would you choose? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 7. Children who never blink. What would you do if children knocked on your cabin window at 3 in the morning, miles from any town, asking to come inside with voices that sound wrong and eyes that glow red in the darkness. Because that is exactly what happened to me in the Pennsylvania Pine Barrens 2 weeks ago, and I'm still not convinced those things were children at all. My name is Daniel, and I am a freelance writer from Philadelphia who needed to escape the city noise and finish a book on deadline. I rented a hunting cabin deep in the Pine Barrens of north-central Pennsylvania, one of the most isolated and eerie stretches of wilderness on the East Coast. 50,000 acres of dense forest, abandoned logging roads, and a silence so complete it feels like the world has forgotten this place exists. Perfect for writing, or so I thought before I learned what else lives in those woods. The cabin was exactly what I needed. Remote, basic, no internet or cell service to distract me. Just a wood stove, a cot, a desk, and windows that looked out into endless trees. The owner had given me a strange warning when he handed over the keys, told me to keep the doors and windows locked after dark, to never respond to knocking no matter how urgent it seemed, and above all, to never look directly at anyone who approached the cabin at night. When I laughed and asked if he was joking, his face remained deadly serious. He wasn't joking. He was terrified. The first 3 days were productive and peaceful. I wrote during daylight, cooked simple meals on the wood stove, and enjoyed the absolute quiet of the forest. But I started noticing things that felt off. Arrangements of stones near the cabin that looked deliberate, like markers or warnings. Scratch marks on the windows that seemed fresh despite the cabin being empty for months. And at night, the silence was too complete. No insects, no owls, no rustling of small animals. Just suffocating quiet that made my ears ring and my nerves scream. On the 4th night, they came. I was working late, the only light coming from my battery-powered lantern, when I heard the first knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the window behind my desk. My blood went cold instantly. That primal fear response that evolution built into us for survival. I was 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, 30 miles from the closest town. Nobody should be out there. Nobody could be out there. But someone was knocking. I forced myself to turn around slowly, keeping my eyes down, remembering the owner's warning about not looking directly. Through my peripheral vision, I could see small shapes outside the window, barely visible in the reflected lantern light. Children, or things shaped like children. 3 of them standing perfectly still in the darkness. They knocked again, that same slow rhythm, patient and expectant. My hands were shaking as I reached for my flashlight, telling myself this had to be a prank. Local kids trying to scare the city guy. But when I clicked it on and aimed it at the window, keeping my gaze averted, what I saw made my stomach drop with horror. They were children, maybe 8 to 10 years old, wearing clothes that looked decades out of style. But their skin was too pale, almost gray in the harsh light, and they stood with an unnatural stillness that no living child could maintain. And their eyes, I caught just a glimpse before forcing myself to look away. Their eyes glowed red like animals caught in headlights, reflecting the flashlight beam with an intensity that was fundamentally wrong. They knocked again, more insistent now, and I heard their voices for the first time. Thin and reedy, speaking in perfect unison like a rehearsed chorus, they asked to be let inside. Said they were lost and cold and needed help. But the words came out wrong. Too measured, too careful, like they were reading from a script in a language they didn't quite understand. Every instinct screamed that these things were not children and whatever they wanted, it wasn't to help. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering, and did exactly what the cabin owner had told me to do. I ignored them completely, turned off my flashlight, covered my ears, and waited for them to leave. The knocking continued for hours, moving from window to window, circling the cabin with methodical patience. Sometimes I could hear them testing doorknobs, rattling locks, scratching at the wood with what sounded like fingernails or maybe something harder, something that carved shallow grooves into the solid oak. Around 4 in the morning, the noises finally stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night, sitting in the corner farthest from any window with a hunting knife I found in a drawer clutched in my shaking hand. When dawn finally broke, I worked up the courage to look outside. Nothing. No footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. No sign that anything had been there at all. Just those fresh scratch marks on the windows and a feeling of overwhelming dread that something terrible had almost happened. I should have left right then. Should have abandoned my writing project and driven back to Philadelphia and never thought about that cabin again. But I stubborn and practical, and I paid for 2 weeks. And in the daylight with sun streaming through the windows, the whole incident seemed almost dreamlike. I convinced myself I imagined it, that isolation and stress had created a vivid nightmare. Nothing more. The second night was worse. They came earlier this time, just after sunset, and there were more of them. 7 children standing in a semicircle around my front door, all wearing the same outdated clothes, all standing with that same disturbing stillness. They knocked in rhythm now, a pattern that felt almost ritualistic, and their voices when they spoke were louder, more demanding. They needed to come in, they insisted. It was important. They had something to tell me, something I needed to hear. All I had to do was open the door and look at them properly and invite them inside. I had done research that day using old books I found in the cabin, local folklore, and Pennsylvania legends. The stories about red-eyed children in the Pine Barrens went back over 100 years. They appeared to isolated hunters and hikers, always at night, always asking to be led inside or helped in some way. Anyone who looked directly into their eyes or invited them into their shelter was never seen again. Search parties would find empty cabins with doors standing open and no sign of the occupant except sometimes their clothes, neatly folded and arranged on the floor. The theories about what they were varied. Some said they were the ghosts of children who died in the forest during harsh winters or gotten lost and starved. Others claimed they were something older and more malevolent, entities that wore the shape of children to exploit human compassion and protective instincts. A few sources suggested they were related to the Jersey Devil legend, offspring or servants of that creature, spreading north into Pennsylvania, this isolated wilderness. But every source agreed on one thing: never look at their eyes, never let them inside, never acknowledge them directly. I followed those rules desperately, sitting in the dark with my hands over my ears as they knocked and called and begged. But this time they were smarter, more manipulative. They started using voices I recognized, mimicking my ex-wife asking why I abandoned our marriage, my mother wondering why I never called, my editor demanding to know where my manuscript was. The voices were perfect, identical to the real people, but coming from those small pale figures outside my windows, and the cognitive dissonance was maddening. Then one of them said my name, my full name, including my middle name that I never used and only appeared on official documents. It spoke with my father, this voice, my father who died 3 years ago, and it asked me to look at it, to really see it, because it had a message from beyond that I needed to hear. My father, this voice begging me to open the door, to stop being afraid, to trust him just one more time. I almost broke, almost looked, almost opened that door because hearing my dead father, his voice speaking with such desperate urgency, overrode every rational thought in my brain. My hand was on the doorknob, turning it slowly, when I caught a glimpse in the window reflection. 7 small figures with glowing red eyes, mouths open far wider than human jaws should allow, teeth that were too sharp and too many, all staring at the door with an intensity that radiated hunger. I jerked my hand back and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing with terror and grief and the horrifying realization of how close I had come to opening that door. The things outside shrieked when I pulled away, a sound nothing like children, a chorus of rage and frustration that shook the cabin walls. They attacked the structure, then really attacked it, slamming against the wood with force that cracked beams and shattered a window on the far side. I could hear them scrambling across the roof, clawing at the chimney, trying desperately to find a way inside before dawn came and forced them back into the forest. I spent that night barricaded in the corner with every sharp object I could find, watching the broken window and praying they couldn't fit through the gap. Just before sunrise, they left again, melting back into the forest with disappointed hisses that sounded almost like promises. They'd be back. They'd keep coming back. And eventually, I'd make a mistake. I left the cabin that morning, abandoning everything except my laptop and my keys. Drove those 30 miles of dirt roads faster than was safe, my rearview mirror showing nothing but empty forest, but my brain convinced I to see those small pale figures chasing my car. When I reached the owner, his house, to return the keys, he took one look at my face and nodded knowingly. He'd seen that expression before, he said, on every person who stayed longer than 3 nights. The cabin was cursed, or blessed, or just unlucky enough to sit in territory that belonged to something else, something that wore the shape of children and used human compassion as bait for a trap nobody survived. I asked him why he kept renting it out if he knew what was there. He looked at me with empty eyes and said he didn't do you have a choice anymore? The things in the forest had rules, older than Pennsylvania itself. The cabin had to remain occupied, had to have fresh people staying regularly, or they expand their territory, start appearing at other homes, other towns. Someone had to be the sacrifice, the offering that kept them contained to that isolated stretch of pine barrens. Better one stranger every few weeks than entire communities under siege. That was 2 weeks ago, and I still can sleep through the night. Because here is the truly horrifying part. I keep seeing them. Not in the forest, but everywhere else. Standing across the street from my apartment, watching me through my office window, following me through crowded Philadelphia streets where nobody else seems to notice them. Small pale figures with eyes that glow red under streetlights, wearing clothes from decades past, always watching, always waiting. I think they followed me home. Think they marked me somehow during those 2 nights of terror, claimed me as unfinished business. And I'm terrified that one night soon, I'll hear that familiar knocking on my door, and those thin reedy voices asking to come inside. And this time they're one, to be a cabin owner, just wanting to save me. This time I'll be alone in the city with neighbors who they'll ignore screaming indoors that one, to hold against something that has been hunting in Pennsylvania, this forest since long before any of us were born. So here, it's my question for you, and I need you to really think about this before answering in the comments. If something knocked on your door late at night claiming to be a lost child needing help, but something felt wrong about the voice or the timing or the situation, would you open the door? Would your compassion outweigh your caution? Or would you be able to ignore a child, this voice begging for help even knowing you might regret it forever? Tell me what you do, because I made my choice in that cabin, and now I am living with the consequences of surviving when maybe I was never supposed to leave at all. Story 8. Lost Village of La Plume. The snow never melted in La Plume. That is what the old maps say, written in faded ink across a town that shouldn't exist anymore. But I found it, and what I discovered beneath that eternal winter will haunt me until the day I die. Have you ever walked through a place where time stopped? Where shadows move in abandoned windows and footprints appear in snow that has been untouched for decades? I have. And the horrifying truth about what happened to La Plume, S300 residents, is something the state of Pennsylvania desperately wants to keep buried. My name is Rachel Torres, and I am a climate researcher studying historical weather patterns in northeastern Pennsylvania. 3 months ago, I stumbled across a meteorological anomaly in the archives. In January of 1964, a freak blizzard hit a small farming community called La Plume. The storm lasted 6 days straight, dumping over 20 feet of snow. When it finally stopped, the entire town had vanished. No survivors, no bodies, just an empty white expanse where a thriving village had stood. The official story claimed everyone evacuated before the worst hit, that families relocated to nearby towns and simply never returned. But here is what made my blood run cold. I found census records from 1965. La Plume was still listed with a population of 312. Someone was reporting numbers for a town that had supposedly been abandoned. The records continued until 1978, then stopped abruptly with a single notation. Area closed by state order. No explanation. No forwarding information. Just a government seal and a classification number I couldn't access. I had to see it for myself. The drive to La Plume took 4 hours through increasingly rural Pennsylvania countryside. My GPS lost signal 20 miles out, and I had to navigate using a 1962 road map I found at a historical society. Modern maps don't show La Plume at all. It's been erased, as if the town never existed. The access road was barely visible, overgrown with trees and choked with brush. I parked where the pavement ended and continued on foot. It was early October, unseasonably warm, but the moment I crossed into what should have been La Plume's town limits, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. And I saw the snow. Impossible. Unnatural snow covering everything in a thick white blanket. Not scattered patches or shaded areas where winter ice lingers. Complete coverage, as if it was still January 1964 and the blizzard had never ended. The boundary was sharp and distinct. Green forest on one side, frozen wasteland on the other. I stepped into the snow and felt something wrong immediately. The cold wasn't normal. It penetrated my jacket, my clothes, straight into my bones. And the silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, No sound except my own breathing and the crunch of my boots in snow that shouldn't to exist. The town emerged from the white like a ghost. Buildings stood intact, preserved perfectly under the snow. A church steeple rising above drifts. Storefronts with faded signs barely visible. Houses with snow piled against their doors and windows. Everything frozen in time. Waiting. I approached the first house carefully. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the temperature was even colder, and I could see my breath forming thick clouds in the dim light filtering through ice-covered windows. The furniture was still there. A dining table set for dinner. Plates with food on them, frozen solid. Coffee cups half full. A newspaper dated January 15th, 1964, spread open on a chair. It looked like everyone had simply stood up in the middle of their meal and walked away. But where did they go? I moved through the house, my unease growing with each room. Upstairs, I found bedrooms with clothes still hanging in closets. A child, his toy on the floor, family photographs on the walls, their faces obscured by frost. Everything was preserved but empty, lifeless, like a museum exhibit of a life that had stopped mid-breath. The creepy thing was the lack of decay. After 60 years, these buildings should have collapsed. The wood should have rotted, but the cold had preserved everything in a state of suspended animation. Frozen, waiting, for what? I left the house and explored further into town. Every building told the same disturbing story. People had been here, living normal lives, and then vanished without warning. No signs of panic, no evidence of evacuation, just absence. The church was the largest building in town, and something drew me toward it. An unsettling feeling that I needed to see inside, that the answers I sought were waiting there in the darkness. The heavy wooden doors were frozen shut, but I managed to force one open enough to squeeze through. The interior was pitch black except for thin gray light coming through stained glass windows caked with ice. My flashlight beam cut through the cold air, illuminating rows of pews. And in every pew, I saw them. People, hundreds of people, sitting in perfect silence, facing the altar. My heart nearly stopped. I thought I found the missing residents. But as I moved closer, my relief turned to horror. They weren't alive. They were frozen solid. Corpses preserved by the impossible cold, sitting upright in the pews like a congregation waiting for a sermon that would never come. Men, women, children, all dressed in their Sunday best, all facing forward with expressions of calm acceptance on their frost-covered faces. This was where La Plume's 312 residents had gone. They walked to the church in the middle of the blizzard and sat down to die together. But why? What could make an entire town choose collective death? I stumbled backward, my mind reeling, and that is when I noticed the altar. Something was written there in what looked like burned wood, large letters scraped into the stone. The cold keeps U.S. safe. Safe from what? A sound broke the terrible silence. A scraping noise coming from somewhere deeper in the church. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my trembling hands, and saw a movement in the shadows behind the altar. A figure stood there, tall and impossibly thin, wearing clothes from another era. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet on strings. And as it stepped into my flashlight beam, I saw its face. Frost-covered skin pulled tight over bone, eyes that were solid white with ice, mouth hanging open in a silent scream. It was one of them, one of the frozen residents. But it was moving. More figures emerged from the darkness. Dozens of them, rising from behind pews, climbing down from the choir loft, converging on my position. All frozen, all dead, all moving with that same horrifying jerking motion. I ran. My boots slipped on the icy floor as I scrambled for the door. Behind me, I heard them following. Not footsteps exactly, but a sliding, scraping sound like bodies being dragged across ice. I burst through the church doors and into the snow-covered street, running blindly, not caring where I went as long as it was away from those things. The town suddenly felt alive with movement. In every window, I saw faces pressed against the glass. Frozen faces watching me. The doors of houses began to open, and more figures emerged into the street. The entire population of La Plume, risen from their 6-decade sleep, converging on the intruder who disturbed their rest. I heard something else then, a sound that made my blood freeze colder than the impossible snow. Singing, hundreds of voices raised in harmony, wordless and haunting, echoing through the empty streets. The same melody over and over, hypnotic and terrible. And I understood. This was what had happened in 1964. Something had called them to the church. Something in that singing that they couldn't resist. They walked through the blizzard, sat down in the pews, and let the cold take them. Willingly, peacefully, because the alternative was worse. Because something else was in La Plume. Something that the cold kept frozen, kept trapped, kept safe. I reached the tree line where the snow ended, and the moment I crossed that boundary, the temperature returned to normal. I looked back at the frozen town and saw them standing at the edge of the snow. Hundreds of frozen figures, motionless now, watching me leave, making sure I left. And behind them, higher up in the town, I saw something massive moving between the buildings. Something that dwarfed the church steeple. Something that the snow and cold kept contained within La Plume's borders. I drove away and didn't stop until I reached the highway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. When I finally pulled over at a rest stop 2 hours later, I found frost covering my jacket. My hair was white with ice crystals, and in my pocket, I found something I hadn't put there. A photograph, old and water damaged. It showed the entire town of La Plume gathered in front of the church. But in the background, barely visible, was a shadow. A massive shadow that didn't match any building or tree. And written on the back of the photo in faded ink, "We chose the cold." It was mercy. I filed my report with the university, recommending further investigation. They rejected it, told me La Plume was a closed case, that I should focus on other research. When I pressed them, I received a visit from 2 men in suits who strongly suggested I forget everything I'd seen. But I can forget, because last week, the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time this fall. And I woke up to find snow on my bedroom floor. Just a small patch. Melting. But it was there. Impossible October snow that came from nowhere. And in that snow, I saw footprints, leading from my window to my bed. Small prints, like a child. This frozen and perfect. La Plume isn't just a lost town. It is a prison. And the cold is the only thing keeping something ancient and horrifying contained within its borders. But what happens when climate change warms the planet? When that eternal snow finally melts? When the prison doors open and whatever La Plume's residents died to contain walks free? So here is my question for you. If you discovered a place where an entire town sacrificed themselves to trap something evil, would you tell the world and risk releasing it? Or would you keep the secret and let them rest in their frozen grave? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 9. Doll, his head in the snow. The creepy ruins of Concrete City. Have you ever found something so disturbing that it changed how you see the world? I did. In the frozen ruins of an abandoned town where something watches from empty windows, arranging objects in patterns that suggest an intelligence that shouldn't exist. What I discovered in Concrete City still haunts my every waking moment. And the terrifying truth is that some places in America are abandoned for reasons nobody wants to acknowledge. I am a freelance photographer, 43 years old, specializing in urban decay. I've explored hundreds of forgotten places across the country, from Detroit factories to California ghost towns. Nothing prepared me for what waited in northeastern Pennsylvania, in the skeletal remains of a company town that died almost a century ago but refuses to stay dead. Concrete City sits outside Nanticoke, built in 1911 for coal miners and their families. 22 identical houses made entirely of concrete, an experimental housing project that failed within a decade. The company abandoned it, and nature began its slow reclamation. By the time I arrived in January 2023, it was a hollow shell wrapped in snow and shadow, the perfect subject for my portfolio. The drive from Scranton took 40 minutes through bleak winter landscape. Gray sky pressed down on bare trees and frozen fields. When I pulled off the main road onto the dirt path leading to the ruins, my phone lost signal completely. The GPS flickered and died. I should have turned back then, but the photographer in me pushed forward, eager to capture those haunted concrete structures in the eerie afternoon light. I parked near the tree line and hiked the last quarter mile. The ruins emerged from the snow like broken teeth, 2 parallel rows of houses facing each other across a snow-covered street that nobody had walked in decades. Every window was dark and empty. Graffiti covered the lower walls, crude tags and spray-painted warnings. But what caught my attention, what sent the first chill down my spine, were the objects. Someone had been arranging things in the snow. Hundreds of items placed with deliberate precision. Rusted tin cans in spirals. broken bottles forming geometric patterns, scraps of fabric tied to dead branches, and dolls, dozens of old dolls, their bodies broken and scattered, positioned at intervals along the street like sentries guarding something unspeakable. The most disturbing sight sat directly in the center of the ruins. A child, its doll head, half buried in fresh snow, its glass eyes staring straight at me. The snow around it was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to indicate how it got there. Just that horrifying porcelain face emerging from pristine white powder, watching with an expression that seemed too knowing, too aware. I raised my camera and started shooting. The place felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, not even the distant sound of traffic. Just crushing quiet that pressed against my eardrums until they ached. The shadows between the buildings seemed darker than normal darkness, thick and somehow solid, like they had weight and presence. I moved deeper into the ruins, photographing everything. The concrete walls were covered in strange markings beyond the usual graffiti. Symbols carved into the material itself, patterns that repeated across multiple buildings. They looked ancient, but the exposed concrete was fresh and pale, suggesting recent creation. Someone was coming here regularly, marking territory, arranging those creepy artifacts with purpose. Inside the first house, I found more dolls. They hung from the ceiling on lengths of wire, spinning slowly in air currents I couldn't feel. Their shadows danced across walls covered in more of those disturbing symbols. The floor was littered with objects that clearly didn't belong. A woman's shoe from the 1950s. A man's wedding ring. A child's stuffed rabbit. Its fur matted with something dark that I didn't want to examine too closely. The fear started as a tickle at the base of my skull. The growing certainty that I wasn't alone. That something was watching from the shadows, patient and utterly silent. I told myself it was just nerves, just the unsettling atmosphere of an abandoned place. But when I turned to leave, I saw fresh footprints in the dust on the concrete floor. Small prints, like a child, his bare feet, leading deeper into the building. I hadn't heard anyone enter. The prints simply appeared, as if materialized from nothing. They led to a doorway opening onto darkness so complete my flashlight couldn't penetrate it. That impossible shadow waited like an open mouth, and every instinct screamed at me to run. Instead, drawn by morbid curiosity and professional obligation, I followed the prints into the next room. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in clouds of vapor. Ice crystals formed on the walls, spreading in fractal patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the center of the room stood more dolls, arranged in a perfect circle, all facing inward toward a single object. Another doll head, but this one was different. Its eyes moved, not my imagination, not tricks of light. The glass eyes tracked me as I entered, following my movement with horrifying awareness. I ran. Pure terror overwhelmed every rational thought. My camera banged against my chest as I crashed through doorways and stumbled over debris. Behind me, I heard sounds. Not footsteps, but something sliding across concrete, accompanied by the creepy mechanical clicking of dozens of doll heads turning in unison. Outside, the winter afternoon had transformed into something nightmare-inducing. The sky had darkened to bruised purple despite being only 4 in the afternoon. Fog rolled between the buildings, thick and unnatural, carrying the stench of decay and something chemical that burned my nostrils. And the dolls had moved. Every single one now faced the building I just exited, their heads turned at identical angles, watching with blank expressions that conveyed more menace than any human face ever could. I heard my name, not spoken aloud but whispered directly into my brain, bypassing my ears entirely. A child, this voice, but wrong, like multiple children speaking in perfect unison. It called me back, promising to show me secrets, to reveal the truth about Concrete City and why it was really abandoned. The temptation was overwhelming, a compulsion that pulled at my chest like invisible strings. I ran for my truck instead, slipping on ice, falling hard enough to crack a rib. The pain helped clear my head. I dragged myself up and kept moving while that terrible voice whispered promises and threats. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to mere feet. The concrete ruins seemed to shift position around me, blocking paths that had been clear moments before. Then I saw them, figures standing in the fog. Not moving, just standing there in perfect stillness. Children, or things shaped like children, wearing clothes from different eras. Some in modern winter coats, others in dresses and knickers from the 1920s. All of them had the same blank expression, the same two knowing eyes. And as I watched, frozen by fear so intense I couldn't breathe, they began walking toward me in lockstep, moving with mechanical precision. I finally reached my truck and fumbled with frozen fingers to unlock the door. The figures were 50 feet away, 40, 30, moving faster now, their feet leaving no prints in the snow. I got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and hitting the locks. The engine turned over on the third try, and I gunned the accelerator, fishtailing on the icy path. In my rearview mirror, I saw them standing at the edge of the ruins, perfectly still again, watching me flee. The doll heads scattered across the landscape all faced my direction, tracking my escape. That image burned into my memory, a chilling reminder that some places harbor presences that defy explanation. I drove straight home to Philadelphia, 6 hours of white-knuckle terror on icy highways. I didn't stop, didn't eat, barely breathed. The fear had burrowed deep into my chest, a constant weight that wouldn't lift. When I finally reached my apartment and checked my camera, I found something that made my blood freeze. Every photo was corrupted except one, a single image that I didn't remember taking. It showed me standing in that circular room, surrounded by dolls, with a child-sized figure standing directly behind me. The figure, his hand rested on my shoulder, and its face was turned toward the camera. But where the face should be was nothing, just smooth skin, featureless and terrifying, like a mannequin that had never been finished. I deleted everything and tried to forget, but the nightmares started immediately. Every night, I dreamed of Concrete City. I walked those ruins in my sleep, watching the dolls rearrange themselves, seeing those child-shaped figures emerging from the darkness. And in every dream, that voice whispered secrets about what really happened to the families who lived there, why the company abandoned a perfectly functional housing project after only 9 years. The research I did afterward was more disturbing than the experience itself. Multiple people reported similar encounters over the decades. Strange figures in the ruins, objects moving on their own, the overwhelming sense of being watched and hunted. 3 people went missing near Concrete City in the last 20 years. Search teams found nothing, just like always, but locals whispered about the dolls, about how they multiply despite nobody bringing new ones, about the arrangements that appear overnight in patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. I found old newspaper articles from 1920 describing unusual illnesses among the residents. Children speaking in unison, adults reporting shared nightmares, mass hysteria that prompted the evacuation. The official story blamed structural issues with the concrete construction. But between the lines, I read something else. Something terrifying that the authorities couldn't acknowledge then and still can now. The place was built wrong. Not architecturally, but metaphysically. Those experimental concrete structures created spaces that existed slightly outside normal reality, thin places where something could push through from elsewhere. And whatever came through never left. It learned to arrange objects, to manipulate matter, to create lures for the curious and foolish. It collected things, items, memories, and eventually people themselves, stored away in spaces between the walls where physics worked differently. I hated to return to Concrete City, and I never will. But the horror hasn't released me. Sometimes I see dolls in my peripheral vision, positioned in patterns I recognize from the ruins. I find objects in my apartment that I didn't place there, arranged in those same geometric configurations. And twice now, I've awoken at 3 a.m. to find fresh footprints in the dust on my floor, small and child-sized, leading from my bedroom door to my bed and then simply stopping, as if whatever made them vanish while standing over me. The truly chilling realization is that I brought something back with me. Not physically, but as a connection, a thread linking me to that haunted place. The encounter marked me somehow, made me visible to whatever dwells in those ruins. I am being watched even now, hundreds of miles away, by an intelligence that exists partially outside our understanding of reality. Other urban explorers still visit Concrete City. They post photos online, laughing about the creepy dolls and eerie atmosphere, treating it like entertainment. None of them understand that they are walking into a trap, that every visit feeds whatever waits there. And some of them, a disturbing number, report missing time afterward. Hours they can, to account for gaps in their memories and a lingering sense of wrongness that never quite fades. I've tried warning people, posting about my experience on photography forums. Most dismiss it as creative writing or attention-seeking, but a terrifying few, send private messages describing their own encounters. The same voice calling from darkness, the same figures watching from fog, the same horrible certainty that something ancient and patient has learned to use abandoned places as hunting grounds, luring people with curiosity and marking them for collection. So here, this is what I need to ask you, and I want you to think carefully before answering in the comments. Have you ever visited an abandoned place and felt like something followed you home? Do you find objects arranged in your space that you don't? Do you remember placing there? Because if you have, you might already be marked, already connected to something that is waiting for the right moment to pull you back into the darkness where it dwells, patient and hungry. Story 10. Thing that followed me home. Have you ever felt something watching you from the trees? Something massive and intelligent that moves through the forest without making a single sound? Because I have, and what I encountered on Blue Mountain in the Pennsylvania wilds wasn't just a scary story or an urban legend. It was real, it was horrifying, and it followed me home. My name is Mike, and I am a wildlife photographer. I've spent 20 years tracking animals through every kind of terrain you can imagine, from the Rockies to the Everglades. I'm not someone who spooks easily. I know the sounds of the forest, the patterns of predators, the difference between imagination and reality. But what happened to me last month in the Pennsylvania wilds shattered everything I thought I understood about the natural world. I'd gone to Blue Mountain to photograph black bears. October is when they were most active, fattening up before winter, and the remote trails near the Susquehanna River are prime territory. I packed for 3 days, set up a base camp near an old logging road, and headed out at dawn with my cameras and tracking equipment. The forest was beautiful that morning, all golden light filtering through red and orange leaves, the air crisp and clean. Perfect conditions. I should have known it was too perfect. The first sign something was wrong came around noon. I was setting up near a stream, waiting for bears to come drink, when every sound in the forest just stopped. Complete silence. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just an eerie, suffocating quiet that made my skin crawl. In 20 years of fieldwork, I only experienced that kind of silence a handful of times, and it always meant one thing. A major predator was nearby. I scanned the tree line, looking for mountain lions or bears, but saw nothing. The silence stretched on for 10 full minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs the entire time. Then I smelled it, a stench so powerful and disturbing it made me gag, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else, something I couldn't identify but registered in my brain as fundamentally wrong. The smell of a predator I didn't recognize. That is when I heard the breathing. Deep, rhythmic breaths coming from somewhere behind me, maybe 30 yards into the dense underbrush. Too loud to be human, too controlled to be an animal. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming danger, and caught movement between the trees. Something tall, impossibly tall, covered in dark hair, moving parallel to my position. It was watching me, keeping pace, staying just out of clear sight. My hands shook as I raised my camera. I photographed grizzlies at 20 feet, swam with bull sharks, tracked jaguars through the Amazon. But this was different. This was fear on a level 1, never experienced, primal and absolute. I snapped 3 photos before my brain caught up with what I was seeing, and I ran. I crashed through the forest like a terrified animal, abandoning my equipment, my training, everything except the desperate need to get away from whatever was back there. Branches tore at my face and arms. My lungs burned. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running but walking, those impossibly long strides covering ground faster than my panicked sprint. Trees snapped like toothpicks as it moved through the dense forest, pushing aside obstacles that would have stopped a bear or moose. I made it back to my camp in half the time it should have taken, adrenaline driving me forward. I grabbed my keys, left everything else, and drove down that mountain road doing 50 on curves meant for 20. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My whole body felt electrified with terror. In my rearview mirror, the forest looked different somehow, darker and more menacing, like it was watching me leave. I should have gone straight home to Pittsburgh, should have called it a nightmare, deleted the photos, never gone back. But I am a photographer, and I am stubborn. And 3 days later, I was sitting in my apartment staring at those images on my computer screen, trying to convince myself I imagined it all. I hadn't imagined anything. The photos were blurry but clear enough to see the shape between the trees. 8 feet tall at least, maybe more, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, with shoulders broader than any human or bear. The face was partially visible in one shot, and it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. Not quite ape, not quite human, but something in between that shouldn't exist. The eyes reflected my camera flash, glowing white like a night animal, but the intelligence behind them was unmistakable. It knew I was photographing it. It knew exactly what I was doing. I started researching. Pennsylvania has more Bigfoot sightings than almost any other state, hundreds of reports spanning decades, concentrated heavily in the PA Wilds region. Blue Mountain alone has generated over 60 credible encounters since the 1970s. Hikers, hunters, forest rangers, all describing the same thing. A massive bipedal creature covered in hair, leaving footprints 18 inches long, moving through the forest with impossible silence. The local indigenous tribes called it Yakwaviak, the hairy giant, and they've been warning people about Blue Mountain for centuries. The reports were chilling in their consistency. Multiple witnesses described the same overwhelming smell, the same eerie silence before an encounter, the same feeling of being watched by something that didn't want to be seen. Several people mentioned something that made my blood run cold. The thing would follow them, sometimes for miles, staying just out of sight but making its presence known. Testing them, deciding whether they were a threat. One report from 2019 was particularly terrifying. A hunter near the same area I'd been photographing had his tree stand shaken violently by something he never saw clearly. He fired his rifle into the air, and whatever it was screamed, a sound he described as like nothing on earth, half roar and half human shriek that echoed across the valley. Other hunters heard it from miles away. The man never went back to those woods. I told myself I was done, that I'd gotten lucky and survived and should leave it alone. But the photos wouldn't let me rest. They were proof, real photographic evidence of something science claimed didn't exist. I could submit them to researchers, maybe even get them published. It would make my career. So 2 weeks ago, I went back. Different trail this time, different approach, but same general area. I brought better cameras, telephoto lenses, and a gun I barely knew how to use but made me feel slightly safer. The forest was different now. Colder, darker, even though it was the same time of day. The trees seemed to lean in closer, the shadows deeper and more menacing. That same unsettling quiet hung over everything. I found tracks within an hour, fresh prints in soft mud near a creek, each one massive and clearly showing 5 toes, a flat foot, and a stride length that suggested something over 7 feet tall had walked through here recently. My heart raced as I photographed them, measured them, tried to stay calm and scientific. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then I found the tree breaks. Saplings and branches snapped off 8 to 9 feet up, bent and twisted in ways that suggested incredible strength. Territorial markers, according to the research, ways for these creatures to communicate and warn others away. I was in something's territory, and it knew I was here. The smell hit me next, that same horrifying stench of wet fur and decay. This time it was stronger, closer, making my eyes water. I spun around, camera ready, and saw it standing at the edge of a clearing maybe 50 yards away. It wasn't hiding anymore. It was just standing there in full view, watching me with those disturbingly intelligent eyes, its massive chest rising and falling with slow breaths. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. I could see details now that my panicked brain had missed before. The reddish-brown hair was longer than I thought, shaggy and matted in places. The face was flatter than an ape, with a pronounced brow ridge and a nose that looked almost human. Its hands hung past its knees, fingers long and thick, capable of snapping those trees like twigs. This was a creature built for power and endurance, something that ruled these mountains and didn't fear humans at all. It took a step forward, then another. Each movement was deliberate and controlled, those long legs covering ground with frightening speed despite appearing to move slowly. It was coming for me, not aggressively but purposefully, like it had made a decision and nothing would stop it. My camera dropped from my hands. I stumbled backward, tripped over roots, fell hard on the forest floor. The thing stopped 10 feet away. I could hear its breathing now, smell its breath, see the intelligence and curiosity in its eyes as it studied me. It reached out one massive hand toward my fallen camera, and I thought I was going to die. Thought this was the moment it would grab me and drag me into the forest and I to become another missing person statistic in the Pennsylvania wilds. But it just picked up the camera, turned it over in its hand like a child examining a toy, then set it down carefully and backed away. It melted into the forest without a sound, leaving me gasping and crying on the ground, covered in leaves and mud in my own fear. When I finally found the courage to stand and grab my camera, I ran again, didn't stop until I reached my car. But here, it's the truly horrifying part, the nightmare that won. Let me sleep. It followed me home. I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment building in Pittsburgh, 40 miles from Blue Mountain. Urban environment, busy streets, nowhere a creature like that should be able to exist without being seen. But every night for the past week, I heard something on my fire escape. Heavy footsteps, the creak of metal under enormous weight, that same rhythmic breathing. When I look out my window, I see shadows that are too tall, too broad, moving in ways nothing human should move. Last night, I found a handprint on my bedroom window, pressed against the glass from outside, 3 stories up, a print so large my entire hand fit inside the palm. I measured it this morning, 11 inches across. It is still watching me, still following me, and I don't know what it wants or why it won. Leave me alone. Maybe I crossed some line by coming back, by taking those photos, by refusing to respect its territory. Maybe it sees me as a threat that needs to be eliminated. Or maybe, and this is what terrifies me most, it's just curious about me the same way I was curious about it, and it won't stop until it has satisfied that curiosity. The worst part is that nobody believes me. They look at my photos and see shadows and blurry shapes that could be anything. They hear my story and think I am having a breakdown, that the stress of fieldwork finally got to me. But I know what I saw. I know what is out there in the Pennsylvania wilds, walking through forests that humans think they own, watching us with ancient eyes and deciding whether we worth tolerating. And I know it is still watching me right now, waiting for something I don't to understand. So here is my question for you, and I really want you to think about this before answering in the comments. If you had irrefutable proof of something science says doesn't exist, something dangerous and intelligent that is now focused on you personally, would you share that proof with the world knowing it might come after you? Or would you destroy the evidence and hope it loses interest and leaves you alone? Tell me what you do, because I have those photos on my computer right now, and I need to decide whether my life is worth more than the truth.